So it says you are live. Do you guys see that on your screen?
Yes.
Okay, we're live.
And I don't believe it. So this is what I do. I go over to my Twitter profile, right? This is my thing, and it's become a ritual too. So, and afterwards, I usually get like a little piece of chocolate. So I go over to my Twitter and I scroll down and see if we are truly live. And I see us. We did it. We're live. And I click back to you guys. We did it. We did it. This is Israel and the Middle East, part 3. Part 2. It's really part 2. Part 1 doesn't count. Part 2. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you everybody else for joining us. This is really exciting for me. Thank you, Jake. Thank you, David.
Thanks so much,
It's
Adam.
great to be here.
So just to introduce myself, I'm Jake Novak. I've been a mostly TV journalist for 26 years, and I'm currently a contributing columnist to CNBC.com. I was the senior editorial columnist there for several years, and I've worked at Fox and other places. And in addition to U.S. regular business news, my real expertise, though, is Middle East, American politics, and economics. So I'm real excited to do this again. And I'm super excited because in addition to just Adam and me, we have Dave Reaboi. And I want to toss it over to Dave because I think he's pretty well known too, maybe better than both of us put together, but I'd love for him to introduce himself.
Sure, thanks. My name is Dave. I've worked in the space, sort of the intersection of policy and public affairs and media, specifically on the national security space for quite a long time now. And again, one of my niches is the Middle East, and I'm really glad that we get a chance to talk about it.
And I'm really excited about it also. When I called you guys almost out of the blue, I guess I called you guys about 2 days ago, and I said, can we do this? Because so much has happened since we spoke last time. And I think the last time we had spoken, we covered a lot of territory, but between now and I guess it's 3 weeks later, again, there's just so much more territory to cover. There's been some military contracts have been announced. There have been more countries that, and I'll let you guys talk about it, that seem to be moving in the same direction as Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. And as I emailed both of you, I am kind of the kid in the front row waving his hand. I'm a student here, and I'm sure most of the people joining us right now are students here also. And we're all in the back and front rows wherever we sit, raising our hands, and we're all kind of eager for the class. So Jake, would you be kind enough to kind of pick up where we last left off, and then and Dave, you can cover it from there. Would that be all right?
Yeah. Well, look, I'm a natural newsman, so to me, I like to go with the headline first. And to me, the biggest headline since we last spoke is that now the two major sides in Israel, first led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the opposition leader, eventual prime minister, at least under the current agreement, Benny Gantz, have both agreed to take away any objections they might have to the United States selling the F-35, which many of you have heard be called the ultimate weapon in the universe right now, the F-35 to the United Arab Emirates. There was a little bit of skittishness about that at first. And I think there's some solid reasons for that. The first one being that I think Israel doesn't feel the UAE will likely ever be a belligerent enemy. But I think Dave would agree that this is really probably the most tangible evidence that this piece is for real.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's very right. I mean, I'd like to start off by saying that the three of us are Americans, and we're viewing this through the lens of this isn't a kind of academic study of what's going on in a far off land, but of primary importance is how this will all affect us as Americans. And because we will be talking about the Middle East, obviously. So I think that it's important to know, number one, that the realignment in the Middle East and let's call them the Trump peace treaties are incredibly advantageous to us if we want to disengage, relatively disengage from the region, which is a very popular position here in the United States politically, disengage militarily from several decades of war that now today seems endless. So I think putting it in that context is really proper. It's not like sure, it's fantastic that that those people on the other side of the world are making peace and are putting away old, millennia old hatreds and suspicions in order for something better. That's great and fantastic, but we should always also remember that it is in the best interests of the United States that this happens too, and it happens together with this kind of Trumpian desire to leave less of a footprint in the region.
Yeah, and that's something I'm trying to get an understanding of, because I think where we had left it off last, and I was so interested by it, is because there really wasn't a lot of press in the United States that was kind of giving a whole kind of view of it, kind of a comprehensive view of it, or even a conceptual framework. So I didn't have anything to hang on to, because certainly I know of Israel. I've never been there, and I really should. And I know of many of the other countries, and I know just growing up that there's always been a lot of conflict, right? I grew up knowing there was conflict, and I grew up with knowing every president that it was part of their campaign rhetoric. However, genuinely, I don't know, because I don't understand. I don't know the palace intrigues. Most people don't. I think you guys have a much better sense of it. So where we left off last, Jake said something very interesting, and I've thought about it. He said he said a lot of interesting things. Two of the things that I kind of think about recurring was why aren't more people aware of it? And I wondered if that was kind of a failure by the media. And what Jake said is that he didn't really want to pin it there, which is very fair, because what has happened is that there really wasn't that moment, that visual moment where everybody just puts down their guns. And there just wasn't that kind of very easy visual that we can all kind of attach ourselves to. And it could be like a 10-second image on the news with people putting down their guns and hugging each other. The other thing I thought was very interesting was, of many interesting things, was that, when somebody asked about Kushner's role and about the Trump's administration role and how they were able to succeed, and they had asked, and you had responded that, the advantage they had was not that they were Trump or Kushner or this or that. I mean, those things kind of are movable, right? But it was also just that they didn't have a disadvantage. They didn't have all the legacy. I'm in venture capital, so I think of software companies. They didn't have all the millions of lines of legacy code, is the way I
Yeah.
see it.
If you're in the State Department or you're in that, or an academic, you have had it drilled into your head to the point where you can't think otherwise, that there's no way there can be a wider peace or better peace in the Middle East until the Israeli-Palestinian issue is solved. Now, if you come at it like a financier and you say to yourself, well, yeah, you can't buy that house because you don't have $500,000 right now, but let's see if we can get you a mortgage or a home equity loan. And this is kind of the way it's being looked at. You have to look at it as someone who's not believing there's only one path to a goal. And I think the American people should be very encouraged by the fact that beyond just Middle East peace, this goes beyond other things. But if we can get people who are not indoctrinated in Washington thought and academic thought to help solve some of our problems, think of some of the other things they could handle. And I'm sure, and I think that Dave would say from a policy point of view, this has been what has been so liberating about the Trump administration and the Trump presidency. It's not about them being better human beings or geniuses. It's just that they aren't coming from the same, group, which unfortunately thinks alike, whether they're Republicans or Democrats. It's just they don't get out of that box.
Right. No, I think that's right. It's a mistake also to think that this is a key, and I've said this on Twitter many times. It's a mistake to think that let's say Middle East peace or these particular deals was a key to a lock that had eluded everyone for decades. That's just not the case. nobody in the establishment wanted this. It's really, really important to understand. Nobody wanted this because this doesn't do anything for the peace process industry. It doesn't do anything for, as Jake pointed out, the sort of ideological mass of conventional wisdom that most of the people inside the Beltway, and certainly the international community has been living in. You know, they want basically the same thing that that the Arab League wanted in late 1967 when they got together in Khartoum and they said about Israel, no recognition, no peace, no negotiations. You know, it was the famous 3 no's. And it's kind of poetic that now the site of that, defiant, those defiant 3 no's, Khartoum in Sudan is the latest country to come to the table with Israel and be taken off the terror list in the United States. I think that's poetic, but it's also significant. And none of the people in the Ben Rhodes calls it the blob, but he's actually really talking about himself and his peers and supporters when he says that. But there is a foreign policy consensus throughout DC, from the think tanks to the State Department to international organizations, etc. There's a point of view, and that point of view had it such that in order to achieve any kind of peace, it's going to have to be at the expense of Israel. And it did not account for any of this stuff.
Well, so can you help me better understand? And there's a lot of questions here, so I want to make sure we get a chance to the questions. And they're always better than my questions. But just because I'm the kid in the front row and I'm waving my hand kind of the highest, can you help me understand what it means when other countries are now joining that? I mean, are they now kind of taking sides, or how does this affect what happens next, and what does happen next?
Well, what they're doing is they're rejecting what Dave talked about, this dogma that was set in stone in 1967. Now, I know that was 53 years ago, and that's a long time ago, especially if those of you who are watching are younger than 53. I get that. But understand that Israeli or Jewish and Arab relations are thousands, more than 1,000 years old. And the relationship was much better than this incredible denialism of 1967 and then the rise of Islamism, which really led to a genocidal outlook on Jews, which Islam did not have before the Muslim Brotherhood and things like that came around. They're not saying everything was hunky-dory, but a genocidal outlook on Jews in Israel did not exist until the Muslim Brotherhood came around. And then, of course, that turned into Hamas and turned into all kinds of other terrorist groups. So what it really means is that the Arabs are moving away from, okay, a 53-year-old immovable policy, and 53 years is a long time, I recognize that. But remember, before 1933, you had the biggest Arab country and most powerful Arab country at the time in the world, in Egypt, supporting an idea of a state of Israel because they knew would help them economically. And I think Dave will agree that the biggest reason why these peace agreements are so encouraging is that even before the ink has been dry on these agreements, we've already had a lot of economic hookups between the UAE and Israel. This has been going on every day. If you're like me and you're on LinkedIn and you've ever written anything about Israel, you've probably gotten a lot of connections from people in the UAE every day since that. It's happening to me. I think it's happening to Dave, and I'm sure you can talk more about it.
Yeah, please do, Dave.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I'm not on LinkedIn. Maybe I should be. Maybe I'll be getting these notifications.
Yeah.
But it's funny when I'm looking at the comments here, and I think someone says that it feels like Trump called a bluff when he moved the embassy to Jerusalem. And I think that's exactly right. And the folks in the White House knew it and understood it as such. I mean, I was talking to them at the time, and they totally got it. And the main idea was that this Palestinian demand of having, of taking Jerusalem as the capital of a Palestinian state was stupid. It's stupid because it's a non-starter. It's not a way to. It's not anything that's going to happen in real life. So by taking that off the table, Trump effectively said, "Look, we're not going to, you guys are not going to diplomatically try to destroy Israel and negotiate it out of existence. Let's brass tacks, real world stuff here, and let's see if we can make an agreement."
And I interrupted you almost there, but there's such interesting questions. And just as you guys are looking through them, I'm looking through them. And some of this we discussed right before this began, because I cheated a little bit, and I had a chance to get a little bit of a preview. And I told Dave, stop telling me so much, because I want to be surprised with everybody else. So we have this question, and thank you so much, Valina, for being here. And she asks, how will the further bifurcation of global affairs between the USA and China affect the Middle East? And Dave, what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. I mean, this is a tricky one because it's really the same situation that you see in Europe right now, and really everywhere, because the Chinese have a lot of cards to play. They have a lot of money, and they have been very diligent in investing it in a lot of places. You have countries like Israel, like Hungary, like I mean, those are two really good examples. Kind of torn between these two poles, because they want to take advantage of opportunities from China, on one hand, and but on the other hand, they're kind of more, let's say, civilizationally more sympathetic to the United States and to the West. You also have to. I mean, you can't blame them for jumping on a good deal when it exists. So it's a tightrope that they have to walk. But frankly, it's no different a tightrope than any, smaller country has had to walk throughout, throughout history between two big powers.
And then, Jake, I remember you had said something about there was a port. Was it the Haifa port? And you said that also changes how. Actually, you picked it up from there. So
yeah. Well, you can see the answer to your question, our posted question here, in real time right now with the Haifa port in Israel right now. So I wrote last September for CNBC that Israel had a tough choice to make about how much more it was going to do in concert with China, because it was angering the U.S. administration, and it was also threatening some of Israel's national security. I have friends who are in the IDF whose commanders have told them, don't bring a Huawei phone onto my base, because they work in some of these intelligence bases. That's just one example. So there's that. So Israel, I think, was basically making the right choice. They were already starting to push China away. I advised Israel to do that, despite the fact that I've been much more understanding of Israel's plight. If you know anything about Jewish history, you should know Jewish people, whether it's Israel or not, should never put all their eggs in one basket. It always turns out bad, whether it's Spain or Germany or England or whatever. But in this case, I felt like China was too much of a risk. Well, now the decision, Adam, is a lot easier, in my opinion, because they are cultivating some other options. And guess who's coming along with some exciting ideas with how to develop the Haifa port? The United Arab Emirates. Now, they don't have the money that China has. They don't have the expertise. But again, if you think of it from a finance mind and how you can now broker another partner in a deal, and now if the UAE is going to get involved with what they have and how they can bring in so many other Arab countries to use that port and use the Haifa port as their gateway to the West, which is what some people are hoping to make it, then you start seeing you have some other options. Now, I think China is still going to have a hand in the management of one of the two Haifa ports. There's the old Haifa port and there's the new Haifa port. I don't want to get too much in the weeds about that, but just understand that there are other players now involved in all of that. And it's very, very encouraging. And I think that we'll see this in other areas as well. Israel is now, I would say, the final answer to your question is Israel is now 50 to 60% less likely to become a part of the Belt and Road Project, which I know Adam is such an expert on, than they were before these peace deals were signed. That is incredibly significant for the United States and the world.
So, and what in terms of, there's just so many good questions, and I'm going to put one of these up here, actually. It's not a question, it's a comment. And thank MFN 122. Thank you so much for being here. Says Saudis for peace. So that's so thoughtful. And I really appreciate that sentiment. And I'm again that kid in the back row trying to understand what peace looks like, and once peace is established, what is the peace that we're establishing, and then what happens next? So, and I want to get back to China in just a moment, but Saudi Arabia is now becoming much more engaged in this. Is this something that I've understood, Dave, over the last few days and weeks? I've heard their name a lot more. Is that right?
I guess we're hearing the same thing. I always thought that it would take a little bit longer for Saudi Arabia because, frankly, I thought that it would take until MBS assumes full control of the kingdom for this kind of thing to happen. But I understand that frankly, the pressure is on. All of these countries. We can get political, but all of these countries have a great relationship with this administration and this president. And the idea of Joe Biden and his folks coming in, I mean, you can just go down the list of national security advisors that Biden has, or who are kind of big shots in the Democratic Party. Look, the reason why all these countries have come together in this way a few years ago is because Obama was so terrible in the region that he brought our allies our allies together in an attempt to sort of rebalance rebalance things away from Iran and from the Muslim Brotherhood Islamists. So I think a lot of these countries are looking and they're saying, what can we do to help Trump? And I think it's absolutely reasonable when people talk about foreign influence and blah, blah, blah. No, I'm sorry, BS. Countries have interests in the U.S. presidential election. And if they say, you know what, we want to help out one particular candidate because he has done good for us and good for the world and good for the region, then I think it's their right to do so. So
what does that display? So if they become, what would that? So if Saudi Arabia kind of is now emergent within the administration's relationships or continuing to be, does that displace an existing power structure or existing relationships? I mean, does it have to be? Yeah.
No, the U.S. Saudi relationship, goes back really before anything diplomatically in this country. So it goes back until really from FDR's time. But lately, we've seen it Saudi Arabia become a very partisan issue. The Democrats have joined the side of the Qataris, and a sort of Islamist anti-Saudi argument that they've been making, which is that at the end of the day they prefer the what they consider to be the authentic voice of the Muslim world being Islamists. So naturally they would like to see the Saudi monarchy displaced. So that makes, just to finish the thought, so that makes the Saudis more appreciative of Republicans and conservatives who pretty much want to keep the status quo, and Republicans and conservatives understand that the greatest threat to us and to the world is in that region are in fact Islamists. And the Saudi monarchy is a good bulwark against Islamists. And
just there's so many good questions here, and I've got another good question, my own question, and then I'll get into a lot of other people's. And I remember Jake was discussing it somewhat, and I had a lot of people DM me about how Jake's history was so important to understand about the relationship with Persia and about all the nuances of the relationships and how they've coexisted with Israel and the Jews historically. Do you see that happening again? I mean, do you see those kind of peaceful coexistence as something that can happen as peace progresses?
Well, if we back the right horse, it will. I mean, what Dave is talking about is really, really important. Islamism is new. Okay, it's new by any historical standard. I trace it back to the beginning of the 20th century, basically. And it got a huge boost from, surprise, surprise, the Nazis. The Nazis funded it. They spread it throughout the Muslim and Arab world. And their influence, sadly, still lives in the form of Islamism. Now, what's really great is that Saudi Arabia has not only said that's enough, but they've gotten rid of a lot of their anti-American and anti-Israel clerics. You're starting to see the connection here. You can't be anti-Israel without being anti-American in the Middle East. And the Saudis know that. And the other big difference is, Dave mentioned it. The Trump administration has cultivated a friendship with Saudi Arabia to promote peace. Now, with all due respect to the Bush administration, their relationship that they cultivated with the Saudis was to promote a war against Iraq. And we can argue about that war all day. I'm shedding no tears for Saddam Hussein or his regime, don't get me wrong. However, it's obvious now that there probably was an opportunity then, maybe not as good then as it is now, to have said to the Saudis, we know you have some reforming groups within your government. Now, Mohammed bin Salman was probably, 15 years old right then, so it wasn't him. But there may have been people like him at that time who the Bush administration could have gone to and said, listen, 9/11 and all this terrorism against Israel is a result of Islamism. And that's not good for you, because guess who is always going to be the #1 country for Islamism? It ain't you, it's going to be Iran. So if you want to be the dominant force in the Islamic world or the Arab world, and I know that the Persians aren't Arabs, and that's an important discussion to have, but still, if you want to be the dominant force in the Middle East Muslim world, you're not going to do it by being Islamist or Wahhabist. And
then you had said something else, and now I want to continue, because there's so many more countries that are becoming participants in this, is that the business implications, because I think I recall you saying that Bahrain had established their first sovereign wealth office over there. And now that...
The UAE, but yeah.
I'm sorry, was the UAE?
The UAE, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for correcting me. Right. And now that that's happened, and that kind of chasm has been jumped, right? Is that something that now is going to be kind of replicated from Middle East country to Middle East country? I mean, Dave, do you see that happening? Because I know this is a big part of your own studies.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not. You guys are the finance guys. I wouldn't want to take. I wouldn't want to take a question like that in regards to sovereign wealth funds. But the big picture answer, I think, is that this will all flow naturally.
Yeah, Jake, what do you?
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
No.
Yeah, well, I mean, we talked a lot about it last time, right? There's so much that Israel has to offer. Now, you have all these Arab countries that are basically still trading on one commodity, and that is oil, which means they need derivative fintech, they need insurance fintech, they need all the kinds of things that Israel already offers to the world in many different ways. They also need security. They need cybersecurity very badly, in addition to military security. So it's really, listen, you take a look at a place like Dubai, and it's an incredibly modern city. They've got a lot going for it, but it's not diversified enough. I mean, what do they have? They have oil money, and they have these retail and real estate type entities there, and sports, and they have a great airline. From what I understand, Emirates Air is awesome. So all that is great, but they need to diversify it. Mohammed bin Salman knows that more than anybody. That's been his goal. But, Adam, it goes beyond that. And, another big story to me, another big headline this week is that Hadassah Hospital, which is, I guess, just undeniably the best hospital in the Middle East, is going to set up, they're working on it, is going to set up a branch in Dubai. And to me, that is so huge because, listen, money is important. The military connections are important, but Israeli medical know-how is going to be the thing that strikes the people, the ordinary person. They keep talking about the Arab street. That's going to be something that's going to strike them more than any of those other things.
And how permanently are these things set up in place? And how much longer until these things are kind of irrevocably progressing, that they can't be kind of wound back?
It's going to be hard. I mean, I think they're really getting there. I mean, the regular flights, right now it could be easily reversed, but if you want a timeline, I'd say that by this summer, it's going to take more than 2 years to unravel some of this stuff if you even try. So even if there is a new administration that comes in and tries to embolden Iran, in the first part of that, I think Dave would agree, that would actually tighten the bonds even stronger between these new countries. But if it ever eroded, if anyone wanted to play a free agent, like, Qatar is still mostly on Iran's side, but I have some exclusive information we can share a little bit later about how I think they're ready to straddle some more sides than the usual. Even if that happened, it would take some time.
So, but does Qatar, Qatar, I call it Qatar. I know it's supposed to be called Qatar. I don't care. So, and I know David has written a lot about this. And in fact, you were part of a movie about kind of the hostilities of the regime and how their efforts were to intrude upon American political affairs and to infiltrate think tanks and their own practices. What then happens? Does Qatar then choose a side and just stop doing that hostility? Or does that hostility in itself start getting unwound? And does that mean that now there's a new adversary and they're going to start, if Qatar were to decline, it were to kind of disengage from the hostility, does that mean that there's a new adversary that would then fill that vacuum? And how does that work?
I'm really anxious to hear the exclusive information here on Qatar, because maybe I'll be proven wrong. I mean, it's happened a couple times.
There've been headlines,
but I have, as you said, I was in a film called Blood Money that describes, really, I think it's about the new Middle East, sort of the kind of meta thing that it's about is about that. But in specifics, it talks about the efforts that Qatar has undertaken to influence public opinion and policy in the United States. And as you pointed out, it has to do with think tanks. We have a kind of classic WikiLeaks cable from a Qatari from a Qatari saying that Brookings, which is the largest think tank in inside the Beltway, they say Brookings is our aircraft carrier, so it's worth more in the influence game.
Do they really say that? I think I remember that Brookings is there. We're going to take the
report in the New York Times.
That's remarkable. I remember seeing it. It's a great movie. It's only like 30 minutes long. It's a good documentary, and it does discuss that. Because those are a lot of the same mechanisms that the Chinese Communist Party employs. The Chinese Communist Party has a lot more formalized and they've got an infrastructure, while as it doesn't appear that Qatar, as you described, does. It just seems like Qatar is just spending money, while as the Chinese Communist Party has built an apparatus over the last 70 years that's extremely evolved, and they've put a lot of people on their payroll, but they also look at it kind of scientifically, while as they're not just haphazardly throwing money.
So Adam, let me quench David's curiosity and everyone's curiosity about this thing with Qatar. Everything you said is true about Qatar, but this is something that I've known about for a couple of weeks, and I think that when the story finally comes out, for those of us who are really familiar with the situation, it'll be a big blockbuster. I have confirmation that, so we all know that Qatar controls Al Jazeera and the content on Al Jazeera. And for all of its editorial messages that I wouldn't agree with, there's no denying that Al Jazeera has brought a level of broadcast quality, and it's an umbrella in the area as far as who it reaches. Well, Al Jazeera has made an agreement to hire at a very high level position a recently departed member of the Trump administration who's going to have a very big role there. And I'm not at liberty to say his name because of a confidence. But let me say that there is no way that this person would ever join Al Jazeera or anything connected with it unless he was given tremendous guarantees that the messaging on Al Jazeera wanted to change. In fact, I'm very certain he was hired in hopes that Al Jazeera basically came to him and said, we want to have a more pro-American, a more pro-Israel message. Now, I'm not naive. I still think Qatar will try to play a lot of different games. There's a Yiddish phrase that really works with them. They like to dance at all weddings, and they'll still try to do that. But if you can imagine an Al Jazeera that promotes fewer anti-American messages, remember they had an Al Jazeera American network which failed, but every night was really giving us a good harbinger of where the Democratic Party has gone to now. 6-7 years ago, Al Jazeera every single night was reminding America how racist and terrible it was. It was that show with Soledad O'Brien, which failed miserably. People didn't want to see it, but for some reason they think that's a good political platform right now. But 6 years ago, we had a telegraph of this. So imagine how powerful that will be if Al Jazeera changes that message. Now, this hire is going to happen. I don't know how long it's going to last. But to me, this is a very encouraging sign, because Qatar doesn't hire this guy, and this guy doesn't join Al Jazeera, Qatar's network, unless Qatar's thinking we better think of a future without being such a toady to Iran and without trying to be so negative. It's a positive sign. It's not the end of all of our problems with that, but it's a positive.
So John Bolton is going to be working for Al Jazeera.
No, it's not. It's not him. It's someone even more pro-Israel than John Bolton.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that was my first guess, and maybe it would have been something in the way of an explanation for why he was seen photographed bumbling around Doha last year.
But is this something that's durable? So if that person does, and there's so many questions, I'm going to have to get to them, and I like this part of it, is that something that's durable? So if that person goes there, and I've heard these things for 20 years, right? I've heard these things for 30 years about peace, and I've only understood everything superficially, right? They're good campaign rhetoric, but I really wasn't emotionally or financially engaged in it, nor do I have any family lineage that's really engaged in it.
And look, no matter what happens, no matter who Al Jazeera hires, I think there are a lot of structural reasons for why Qatar will never join let's say, an authentically pro-Israel, pro-West alliance. It may make some noises and say, okay, fine, sure, sign on the dotted line, but they understand themselves. Look, they've been very successful. I wrote a piece about this, about how they have the Qataris have positioned themselves in the way in which the old Syrian regime used to position itself, which is like sort of the head of the axis of resistance. Erdogan now occupies this role, which is we're going to be the loudest, angriest, most anti-Israel folks on the block and anti-Western folks on the block, and because we get a tremendous amount of street cred from it with local Middle Eastern radicals. Now, what's absurd and different is that this used to be a message that some of these countries, the Hafez al-Assad regime and Erdogan and Turkey under Erdogan is doing. They're doing it for kind of domestic consumption and regional consumption, but the Qataris are doing it for Western left consumption. So they have figured out a sweet spot where they can be, where the Qatari message is the leftist message. So that's why you see that messaging from what's his name, Hassan on Al Jazeera, goes to CNN, they figured out a kind of perfect way to keep their messaging in like anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist kind of lines. And so for that reason, they've won over the press corps internationally with this particular line of messaging. And so why would they change? They view nationalists and Trump people and conservatives as losers and as the enemy. So they're not going to all of a sudden go and switch horses in midstream.
Gotcha. So we're gonna skip around because now I see a lot of questions. There were a lot of questions before. Now I'm gonna go through them. Yeah, and I'll show you guys them. So Guy Mishmish says you have to go to Israel. I had a big opportunity there. I know you've said that, and thank you once again for joining us. And I also think about your comments about the real estate there. When you were asking about the real estate, you were commenting on the real estate, and then Jake was in agreement that real estate is going to do good, and that's I'm not an investor in that, but that is interesting. And so love your thoughts on Jared Kushner's role in the peace deals, which is something I try to remove the politics from it. You know, I've been in this stuff for a long time, so I'm kind of that old guy now that just that watches his son, you know, play baseball and tries to look at it kind of objectively as to what they could be doing right or wrong, and not really be a cheerleader too much, rather than, you know. So I am very interested in it and how this occurred. And so thank you so much. Let me just go back to it. Thank you so much, Pastor Derek T, for asking that. And the People's Cube asked the same thing. I think people really do want to know. Even the people that are very critical of Trump still want to know what's occurring in reality, you know, outside of a small kind of world that we live in, which is getting smaller and smaller. I really truly want to know what's happened and why this time it worked, while before it didn't. So the People's Cube, thank you so much for being here, says, why and how did Trump make peace look so easy?
Yeah, well, I mean, the easy answer is a little bit of what we referred to before. It wasn't a group of people that were convinced by years of State Department careers or years in academia that it was an intractable problem. If you decide that you're not going to accept what everyone accepts as a given at the start, and you decide to look at it from another angle, which is, sadly, listen, the news media in Washington are very similar. There's a tremendous amount of groupthink that goes on there. And there's not a lot of, I mean, we could talk about this, for example, with the way the Trump administration is approaching the African-American community as well. Similar, like if you just stop thinking that X is a given.
I don't want to wander too much, right?
Yeah, I understand. But if you just decide that X is not a given, you can get there. But I'll say something else, which is a little bit of a joke, but it's also true. Listen, if you've dealt with real estate, the real estate business in Manhattan for all the years that he did, these are some of the lowest life, tough, cutthroat people out there. And it's possible that Trump looked at it and said, this isn't as bad as what I dealt with on the West Side Highway. You know, I mean, honestly, I'm not really saying that completely as a joke. There's some truth to that.
And keep in mind, I do try and keep politics out of everything in my life, because at the end of the day, I'm an investor and I want to have scenarios if Trump wins, if Biden wins, or whatever happens, right? So I try and plot things out and then kind of weigh them out. But I am so just kind of like intellectually inquisitive about what's happening in the Middle East and what's happening with Israel. And I think Gerald Chambers, thank you so much for being here. C4 CEO, and you've got to do more periscopes. Says, comments, amazing how something so big and heretofore unexpected is so very absent from the news cycle. And it really has been. If it wasn't for kind of my pursuit of news, I would not be aware of the peace arrangements that are going on. That's both of you. I was just saying.
Okay. Well, I'll just, as a news person, I'll just.
I mean,
say, go ahead, Dave.
Please. No, I was going to say.
Go ahead. I'll go. You, Dave. It's all on you.
Okay. No, I mean, I'm just going to refer back to kind of what I said at the opening, which is that none of this makes sense unless you realize that that this was never the goal of much of the people we're talking about. The media is against this. I mean, just go look on Twitter and look at. I mean, absurdly enough, the U.S. Institute for Peace did an article last week, I think, or the week before, bemoaning potential peace between Israel and Saudi Arabia. This is the U.S. Institute.
It's very interesting because at a certain point, and this is kind of what this is about, and then I want to bring this up also. So Kevin Urbanus, thank you so much for being here. Namaste. Makes a comment that I love that there's finally business thinking applied to world politics. And for me, what's interesting as well is I apply business finance to everything in my life, right? I really do. And that can be a good and bad thing. But at a certain point, what's occurring in the Middle East and what's occurring in Israel and all the business implications it has with technology, with defense, and I know, Jake, you want to discuss that, some significant contracts that are going on. But at a certain time, the media has to get dragged along as its advocate and the evangelist for this, not just because of the business implications, but because we're seeing kind of the old narrative unwinding, and we're seeing, and that self-referential loop that has been in place, as you guys have argued for the last 40 years or so, we're seeing that kind of interrupted, right, by the reality of right now, which introduces kind of this new trend that the media has not yet jumped on, but there is clearly a lot of momentum that's now even taken out of the media's desire to dampen that trend. I mean, it just seems like it's quickly becoming its own perpetual motion machine. Is that right?
This has hit the trifecta of every major media bias. Now, those of you who have read the stuff that I've written for a long time, I've talked about the three biggest biases in news media. And as much as political bias and geographical bias are very high, they're numbers 3 and 2. The number one bias in news media ever since it ever began is the bias in favor of negative, sensationalist, bad news. So this hits on all those cylinders. So the reason why the story is suppressed is because it hits on all three of them. It's a good news story. It's geographically not in New York or Washington. They don't care. And 3, it is, it's also a case of something that makes a non-liberal, conservative administration, for lack of a better word, look good. So all three of those things. And I would add a fourth, which is it involves math and business and money and numbers. And most people get into journalism because they can't do math. And I can say that from experience. So honestly, it's amazing we're getting the story at all when you think about it that way. But one of the things I want to talk about is the business aspect of this. Yeah. It seems like it's new. I've seen the questions, and it sounds like it's like a new approach, and it is, but it's just a return to the old approach between these two groups. That's the way it always was before 1933, let's say.
Gotcha. Okay, we got you on that, and I so much appreciate that. It's just we've got a lot of questions we've got to go through. So these are like speed rounds now. And we're going into the really fast part of the speed round. It's going to get faster, but we're going into the fast part. So Valina, again, thank you so much for being here. And Valina and I are going to be doing a Periscope soon because I have a special guest. I'm very excited about it. She's going to co-host it with me because it's a subject she's an expert in. So Valina says, great conversation. How will Israel-UAE relations be impacted by the U.S. election outcome? Dave, what are your thoughts? And Jake, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think we covered this before, which is that at the end of the day, it's going to be very hard to unwind some of these things, especially Israel UAE. I think there is a depth of feeling and sentiment there that I think has taken a lot of people by surprise. We see it on social. We see it on social media, and we see it. We see it in different places. Really, some of the images have been kind of incredible. Seeing the willingness of both Israelis and Emiratis to celebrate peace on an individual basis. Yes, in many ways, governments in all of these countries, especially in countries that are not democracies, have to lead the way when it comes to policy, and eventually they will follow. I mean, the kind of anti-Israel, anti-Western sentiment of the Arab street for so many generations was always pushed and prodded along by the rulers. So now, if we have a different situation, we have a different type of relationship between these countries, I think you'll see things change. The media in these countries has a lot that has a lot to do with it too. Already, we've been seeing TV shows and things like that with Israelis and Jews not being the not being the designated villain and things like that.
Are you seeing that already?
Yes. We've already seen this. I think this past summer there was a big hit series in the Emirates about a Jewish woman or a Jewish family. That's kind of a historical drama. I haven't seen it, but these guys. I mean, look, these guys are really hip as far as this kind of programming goes. The Emirates did a huge maybe 20, 25 episode series on the Muslim Brotherhood from a negative perspective not long ago. And it's good to remember also that they were the first country to designate as terrorists not just the Brotherhood over there, but the Brotherhood in the United States, meaning CARE and some of these other organizations. They refer to them as terrorist organizations. That was in I think 2013.
And so the reason I put up Valina's question again is because now I'm going to extend it to other countries as well. So it's not just exclusively Israel and the UAE. But now what happens when it becomes a perpetual motion machine in itself, right? If enough countries join, and it kind of resolves the impermanence of these things, right? Where it can't be unwound anymore. Now what happens with their own scenarios of if Biden wins or if Trump wins. So how are they kind of hedging their own bets? And how, if Trump wins, do they put more eggs in that basket? Or like what happens next? No. What are their own kind of alternatives and how are they hedging their own bets? And if Biden wins, what are the new bets? And if Trump wins, how do they kind of put more chips on the table?
Well, my guess is,
go ahead, Dave. No, go, Dave.
I was just going to say real quick. My guess is that if Biden wins, in my opinion, God forbid, what that administration will undertake in response to what's been going on in the Middle East is to again try to strike a grand bargain. The Democrats have always been after grand diplomatic gestures with massive multilateral dimensions. 99.9% of the time, this is useless and counterproductive. The Trump administration likes bilats. That's just what it likes to do because you have the interests of 2, maybe 3 countries that can be serviced or advantaged through a thorough bilateral, trilateral agreement. Once you start throwing the entire Middle East into it, once you pull Iran into the table, there's very little meaningful to discuss that's left. I think that's what people like Ben Rhodes will do. Matt Duss, who is Bernie Sanders' foreign policy advisor, totally dangerous, un-American, anti-Israel guy, is going to be the first one to attack both the Israelis and the Saudis and the Emiratis and to embrace Iran. Yeah. So I think it's going to be totally different.
Yeah, and Jake, can you respond to that? And then we've got a lot of questions, and it's been 52 minutes, and I want to be so respectful of everybody's time. But there's just so many questions, and we're going to rip through them. So I'm very interested.
Super quick. Yeah, I'll be super quick. I think that the immediate result will be the same. If Biden wins or if Trump wins, there will be a stronger push to solidify the existing agreements and to make more agreements because they're going to want to present either a new President Biden with facts on the ground, peace facts on the ground, not war facts on the ground that they can't change. And then if Trump wins, they want to present him with a clear example that, they're really looking forward to more of the same. Long term, if Biden wins, then there are some definite threats that Dave referenced to. If they try to create some kind of new deal with Iran to bring Iran into it or something that is just symbolic, it could really be damaging.
Okay, and we're going to skip around. So thank you so much for that. And David, thank you so much for being here. And he has, there's 2 things here. So I'm just going to go past this one really quickly, but I think it's important to say is that he watched Blood Money and the thought he came away with was Qatar is the Eye of Sauron. I thought it was a great documentary. I thought it was the perfect length. And what I'm very interested in, and I've funded journalists all my life. A lot of people know my mentor co-founded CNN with Ted Turner. His name is Reese. And then Reese was the first CEO, and they co-founded it. It's just such a great thing. And then when Reese left, he founded the Food Network, and I've been a part of journalism ever since. Very dear to my heart. So I thought what was very interesting about Blood Money was how deeply they've infiltrated, and they're just paying a premium from mediocre journalists. They're getting basically C-rated journalists, but they're paying them the A wages. And those journalists are really compliant because they did some smears against you and they did some smears against Mike Cernovich. So it was good seeing you guys do the forensics on that. So I'm going to go on to so thank you for saying that. And it gives me a great chance to bring it up. So again, he asked thank you for being here. How big of a threat is Qatar compared to Iran, who receives most of the attention in that region? Jake, what are your thoughts there?
Well, they're the propaganda arm. And propaganda is important in the Arab world. You've heard me reference this before. The Muslim Brotherhood got a huge boost from Nazi Germany in the 1930s. They were a smaller group in Egypt. They didn't have a lot of power. And suddenly, not only did they get money from the Nazis, but they got a daily radio program that the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem broadcast from Berlin throughout the war, if you can believe it. I don't know where he was living in Berlin.
That's incredible. I never heard that.
Yeah. No, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who was a tremendous inspirational leader to the genocidal Muslim Brotherhood, did a daily radio broadcast out of a town near Berlin. He was living in Berlin as a guest of Adolf Hitler during the war. And so that propaganda was very important. One of the most ardent listeners to that radio show was Ruhollah Khomeini, who became Ayatollah Khomeini. It's not a small thing. Words matter, and rhetoric matters. And Qatar is playing that role right now, which is why I'm so hopeful that any watering down of their rhetoric through this hire that they're going to make at Al Jazeera will be positive. But the answer to your question is they're the mouthpiece, and it's not that small a thing to be a mouthpiece to that kind of destructive rhetoric.
Okay, and we're going to skip around. Thank you so much for that. Little Herc, thank you so much for being here. And I love that image. It's really awesome. So they ask, what are some of the biggest opportunity placement zone sectors in the Middle East tech market investments? So what do you see? And I know, Jake, you discussed this a little bit before about military contracts and pharmaceuticals. So where do you see the business opportunities? What should we be looking at as investors as kind of a leading indicator that things are really maturing and there's a lot of intellectual capital and knowledge transfer occurring? And
well, I'd start with the Tel Aviv metropolis. I'm so glad I'm getting a chance to answer this question because I misspoke last time. I said it right the second time, but I meant to say the town of Jaffa. Jaffa is the twin city of Tel Aviv. I said something else, I'm not even going to say it right, and then I got it right. So the expansion of Tel Aviv into Jaffa, which is a much more mixed Jewish-Arab area, it's becoming much more viable. There's a lot of investment opportunity there. Real estate is still, I know it's not as sexy as some of the other tech stuff, but that's one thing that you should be looking at. But yes, pharmaceuticals. Now, the current Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, has done a lot of great things for Israel in his role as prime minister. But when he was in political exile as finance minister, he saved the country on two things that he probably doesn't even ever talk about, which is he reformed their pension system. Israel would be like Greece right now if he hadn't done that. And the second thing is that he mostly deregulated the pharma industry. So, and we're seeing this now with COVID, and we're seeing other things like that. Israel will always be on the cutting edge of something in biotech. Now, if you're the kind of person who likes to take a nice gamble on a low price biotech stock out of Israel, and you can move your money in and out of it and take a profit, you're always going to have an opportunity there because it is a not so regulated market. It's not dangerous. They don't kill people. There's been no fatalities from this, but it is a much less regulated pharma market than the United States is. So to me, those are the two biggest answers to your question. But then again, look at the fintech. If Dubai continues to put some of this money, that wealth, that sovereign wealth into Israel, then look at companies like Lemonade and some of these other new companies. I guess JFrog is another. These are big opportunities.
Gotcha. Thank you so much for that. And here's a really interesting question. And hopefully Tracy is here as well. And I would love, or Anas is here as well. And I'd love to see their comments on it. Is there any correlation between the rhetoric to end fossil fuels and the peace deals?
Yes.
Really?
Yeah, sure. Because a lot of these countries have, these Arab states are not stupid. They see and understand that their economies need to diversify, as Jake pointed out earlier. And I don't think it has to do with a kind of ideological / political view of climate change and things like that. But they have growing populations, and they, one reason why Israel is so attractive to them is because of the high tech sector, which we've pointed out repeatedly, and Israel, better ties with Israel will enable them to diversify their own economies. So I think there's definitely something. There's definitely some linkage there.
Jake?
Look, if they're lucky, and Mohammed bin Salman and the rest of the oil companies will be able to diversify their economies from 100% oil to 80-20. I think that's what they're really looking for. That would be a big deal. And to me, we've talked about this a little bit, Adam, but for those of you who are listening for the first time, a big test case for this is what's going on now in some of the areas in Saudi Arabia where they're trying to build high-tech hubs, working with Amazon, working with Google, and they are literally building a bridge through the Sinai, through, and areas that are also in Israel over into Egypt. And if that works out, then you have a situation where Saudi Arabia is basically saying our business, our economic lifeblood flows through Israel to Egypt, which is really their most important Arab ally, and then further out into the rest of the world. So look at that very carefully. That's what they're trying to do. Mohammed bin Salman wants to be able to say, I brought a tech hub here to this country that has nothing to do with oil. I brought some infrastructure that has nothing to do with oil. And it can't happen, in my opinion, in his opinion, clearly, without Israel.
So it's an interesting thing that Little Herc asked, and so now I put that question on the screen, and thank you again, is the UAE seems to be masters of the new architecture and building structures. Why is this? And then I'm going to ask also, you describe the bridges that are being built and kind of the infrastructure that's now being put in place. Who's doing all that building, and who's doing all the engineering, and who's doing all the cement, and where's the labor coming from? Do you know this?
Well, if it's the Saudis, that means they're probably using laborers from smaller Arab countries. We see that all over the region. Saudi Arabia, one thing you have to understand about it, they don't have a large population. Neither does the UAE. The largest Arab country by population is Egypt. And that's why for so many decades, it was the most important Arab country. But because of military and mostly economic reasons, Saudi Arabia is now the most important Arab country. But your question is important. They don't have the manpower. Neither does Israel, by the way. Neither of those countries have a major force, which is why, Israel's called, one of the reasons why it's called Startup Nation is not just because everyone's such a genius. It's because they have to start up something and let the manufacturing and the heavy work be done somewhere else. They don't have the peeps. Right. They can't do it. So I would expect Saudi Arabia is probably hiring laborers from other countries and maybe even from the Far East, Indonesia, places like that.
I hope it would be labor that's acquired much more compassionately than we're seeing from Qatar.
Yeah.
Which Dave can speak of as an authority, because they're really employing slave labor there. And I have seen media try and defend the slave labor. And to me, it's just an abhorrent type of thing, is they try and present it as some type of arbitrage that's occurring. And, I don't know whether we can think that way in 2020. Right? I mean, it's just a horrible thing. And, I can tell everybody that Dave is an authority. Dave, I know we have to jump around.
I don't know any other country that, where the population is 89 to 90% foreign laborers. And and 10% Qatari citizens. I mean, that's insane. That's something that's a powder keg.
It's upsetting. It's upsetting to be a spectator to it and just feel kind of powerless, because we're all just like little fragile things. We can't do anything about. So Jake, thank you so much for being here. Says peace between the leaders is not peace between people. How will peace impact the latter with other nations?
Well, that's a question that we hear a lot, and I think it's a legitimate question. A lot of people are worried that, the leaders will make peace, but the so-called Arab street, they still hate the Jews, right? And the Jews still hate them, right? And the answer is not so much. Not so much. The fact is that there has been an artificial pumping in of Islamist, rhetoric that's, and it's won over some of the public, but not as much of the public as one might think. And second of all, listen, their leaders are respected and are thought of in ways that we don't think of our democratic leaders in this country. If Mohammed bin Salman and the leaders of the UAE tell their people, like, look, we're going to start trying to work this, then they'll listen. And, Dave noticed this as well. We've seen so many things on social media from regular people. These aren't from the leaders, posting videos of, there was a guy in Dubai playing the Hatikva, which is Israel's national anthem, in the public square. The major newspaper.
I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second, because then we have to move on. But those things, so you're saying that those things are very meaningful because obviously people are not their governing regimes, right? Thank gosh, we're not our governing regime. But you're saying in that type of a political operating system, that type of a pronouncement is like a declaration that then kind of trickles down to the people.
Right.
It's understood.
It's also the trend is your friend. If you're going to tell me that you had 2 million people who were in favor of destroying Israel yesterday, and now it's 1.5 million, I could start working with that. I mean, honestly, folks, you can't have the perfect be the enemy of the good here.
Yeah, interesting. And we've been on for 104 right now, so we're going to try and wrap up in about 10 minutes. So we've got some really fast questions, and so it's like a family feud, and you guys are going to compete against each other.
Well,
so
but before we leave that topic, just to say another word about it, there really is a generational divide that I have noticed when we're talking about folks in the Gulf states. It's over 40 or under 40, and it's really amazing how this works. And I mean, I am. During the Arab Spring uprisings, I was very cynical about it, and saying, "Oh, social media, blah 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 blah. This isn't real and not reflective of the people on the ground." But I'll tell you, at let's say a leadership elite level, there is a world of a difference in worldview between over 40 and under 40. Over 40 is you have a lot of folks who are, let's say, in the diplomatic corps or in elite business or government, opinion makers in the Gulf who, for lack of a better word, they have a European approach to the conflict. They think it's all about the Palestinians, and and it's very much like a kind of post Edward Said grievance studies point of view. They all went to Western universities, and they see themselves as world citizens, and embrace all of those particular prejudices when it comes to the Middle East issues. Under 40, it's a totally different kettle of fish. I know folks who wear MAGA caps on the weekends, who are more similar to American conservatives and American Republicans than they are to Europeans, or frankly, even to their to their older brothers or cousins.
I'm going to interrupt, and then I'm going to move on to another question. But that makes such an interesting point. So if they're going to wear a MAGA hat, right, and everybody knows I'm not political, but are they wearing that as an expression of Trump, or are they wearing that? What are they? How do they identify with that? Is that a Trump thing, or is that an America thing, or how do you?
It's both. They like Trump because he's pro-America. They like Trump because he's a nationalist. The under 40 crowd, let's say in Saudi Arabia and in the Emirates, they are pro-Saudi Arabia. They are pro-Emirates. They are, unabashed nationalists, which is good, and they love America. And
Gotcha.
and they kind of correctly see that the big conflict in the world is now between countries that want to maintain some semblance of their of their traditions and way of life against a kind of globalist consensus that that wants to turn the world into an unaccountable EU managed hellhole.
So you're saying that what they're experiencing there, and I wasn't aware of this. I mean, I don't know. I'm like that. I told you, I'm the kid you can see my hand here. I'm like the kid in the front row who's waving their hand and annoying all the other students behind them. But so what you're saying is that they're nationalist also. They see the threat of just kind of a globalist type of threat themselves that they're responding to. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they see they see what's going on, and the narratives that that a lot of the let's say anti-globalist forces, we can call them nationalist, though the media and has done a good job giving it purposely giving it a bad rap, but I mean, these are patriots in their own countries. And they really buy into, let's say, the Trump, Bolsonaro, Orban, Netanyahu critique of let's say the conventional wisdom globalized West.
Gotcha. So Andy, thank you so much for being here. And Andy asks, China's influence is rapidly growing across the Middle East, but at what cost is that for the U.S.?
Well, that could be a great cost, and that's one of the reasons why it's so great to see the regional group powers within the Middle East hooking up so that China doesn't have as much influence. We were just talking earlier about how China was basically going to have complete control of the Haifa port in Israel. Now the UAE will probably bid against that, and maybe that won't turn out to be a non-China project, but there will be others like it. In other words, the need to rely on China for so many things is now reduced because you have Saudi Arabia basically approving all these deals and working with them, and Israel working with them, and Egypt working with them. So the answer is, this is a great way to counteract China.
Okay, thank you for that. And so now, Anand, thank you so much for being here. Says, will Saudi formalize bilateral relations with Israel in the near future?
Yes.
What type of schedule would you guys put that on? And I think Jake had mentioned something about this before. Maybe it was something that we just did privately, but we were talking about it because I was so intrigued. Where you thought might even be on a slower schedule because of some relationships, palace intrigues with the prince. So has this surprised you how quickly this is moving forward?
No, I think I think that the timeline will be, again, probably decided by the election. I think if Trump wins re-election, I wouldn't be surprised to see a ceremony at the White House before inauguration. Gotcha. If Biden wins, I think the Saudis will hold out for some more, maybe some other agreements and maybe some promises that the Biden group won't unravel all the work that's been done, and then maybe they'll do it as well. It would take longer. Gotcha. But I think if Trump wins the election, the answer is sooner than later.
Speed round. Okay, so Anand, thank you so much for that. And Dave, you said you were expecting it as well. So do you have like a time frame that you're working around, or what's your thoughts?
I thought that that it would take a little more time. I thought that some people were maybe had let enthusiasm get ahead of them when they were predicting that Saudi would join up, shortly after Bahrain and UAE. I think we still have some time to go, but I think that. Yeah, I mean, I agree with Jake. It'll probably be within that that kind of time frame. I mean, I would say months.
So the diplomacy,
or even sooner, based on the election. I mean, we could say, hey, they could do this tomorrow.
Yeah.
As a kind of pre-election thing. I'm not sure if there's a single person who votes based on this issue alone.
I certainly, but I like knowing like what's going on, because I feel the media has kind of left us to our own devices, and that does obviously create
on purpose. Yeah, no, on purpose. And I understand the point of view of the Trump administration wanting to do this in a pre-election way, because hey, that's the only way you get media coverage now.
Yeah, and
if you put it in context of the campaign.
Well, because the media has left us, has abandoned us so much, it does make people like me venture out for the experts that can kind of can backfill all that gap. And I suppose that can also lead people into the wrong directions, because truth and reality can get so fragmented that I'm very selective about what I let into my head, because it's so difficult once it's in there to take it out, to extract it. So I go to you guys. So just a quick question for you, and then we have to get on to the next, because then we're closing up. And I'm going to rip through everyone's questions, and I see a really interesting comment there. But in the language of diplomacy, are they still making sure that that any issues, any existing kind of Palestinian issues, and I don't know the right diplomatic phraseology of it, but that are not being inflamed or agitated? How are they kind of getting buy-in in the language of diplomacy, so they're not kind of creating more opportunities for rifts and for failure?
Well, what kind of buy-in do you need? The Palestinians have not returned calls from the White House in for how long? For more than 2 years already at this point, maybe 3.
But they are
so
they are a wedge,
pardon?
though. They are a wedge, though. I mean,
yeah. Look, they are a wedge, but at some point they have to realize that that they are not going to replace Israel. They're not going to drive the Jews into the sea. Their best case scenario is to have a state that is non-militarized, and with a government that clamps down really hard on terror, because that's just a non-starter. There's no Israeli government in the world that's going to allow an Iran and Turkey and Qatar supplied terror state within its borders. It's just not going to happen.
Gotcha.
Yeah, people are really not realizing how important that peace conference that the administration put up, that Jason Greenblatt and Jared Kushner put up in the summer of 2019 in Bahrain, how crucial that was. That was the Trump administration saying, here's our new idea based on economic partnerships for peace between Israel and the Palestinians. And it would have been one thing if the Palestinians showed up and they walked out and they didn't like it, but they didn't even show up. And that was a huge slap in the face to all those other Arab countries. A tremendous reason why these deals have been signed since then is because the Arab countries looked at them and said, you didn't even come and sit down at the table with us. That was a huge insult and a huge miscalculation among many by the Palestinians.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I'm going to go on to the next ones, but only because I've spent so much money on translators and research teams, the language of diplomacy. So, and you guys study this, so I'm telling you guys what you already know, but it's so different than a normal person could ever take in, because there's so much cultural nuances and history of this person and history of something 50 years ago, and what that little phrase means is something that's so crucial within that language, and it's not just a vernacular that comes and goes. I mean, there's real meanings to these things. Fega Marx says, and Fega Marx, thank you so much for being here, says it's an alliance led by the USA with Israel and the Sunni Arab world.
Fair.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's like Charles Krauthammer used to talk about this all the time. It's that basically this is like Nixon in '72 choosing China over the Soviet Union. We got the Sunni world and we have the Shia world. The Sunni world is clearly the side with which we can work. Iran side is not one we can work with.
Cool. And David, thank you so much for being here. And he's been a go-to for me when I was very interested in the Israeli elections. So thank you so much for joining us. Says, would love to hear more about Qatar and where they are making plays in MENA, M-E-N-A, and the U.S. Dave?
Qatar is a destabilizing power. Their primary ability to wage primary ability to wage war is through influence and media. So, for example, you could very well make the case, and I have done so in the past, that the Arab Spring was a Qatari destabilization project, with using the Muslim Brotherhood as as the agents for toppling their enemies in the monarchies in the region. That would not be incorrect. Al Jazeera functions as a, I mean, when the Saudis and Emiratis and the Egyptians got together and they made demands on the Qataris in the summer of 2017, at the very top of the list of grievances they had against Qatar was, you guys use Al Jazeera as a way of toppling us. You broadcast subversive messages into our countries, and with the idea of trying to topple our monarchies and replace them with Islamists. This is what they do. This is exactly what they do. In the United States, they're able to sort of they're able to influence what our experts say, and also what the media says, and what people study. I see you're
yes,
you're pushing, but
we're in the Family Feud round. No, we're in the family feud round. At the end of it, no, you guys are still competing against each other. Okay, so you guys are competing families. You guys have to buzz in because there's a lot of questions and I want to whip through them. They're so interesting. So Bart, thank you so much for being here. Says, what does peace in the Middle East mean for Russia? Does this make the region less interesting for proxy wars to occur?
Oh, it's really bad news for Russia. Russia has been as destabilizing as Qatar has been. And Russia has been the big bad actor in the Middle East for so long. They basically created the PLO, by the way. The KGB created it. They're kind of like the insects in the Men in Black movies. They like to start wars, and they also like to dance at everybody's wedding. And honestly, not only are they a bad influence in the Middle East, but their Middle East policy is bad for Russia. They should choose a side and stick with it. They don't do it, and peace is going to make things bad for them, but maybe good in the long run.
Gotcha, Dave.
Agree. No. I mean, one of the best things one of the great diplomatic achievements of the 1970s was kicking Russia out of the Middle East. And the Obama administration brought it back. They begged them to come back through Syria. So, so this is really, and I don't think there's anybody in the world that, even Russia, that would make the argument that, oh yeah, everything's better off with the Russians, meddling around in the Middle East.
Okay, and Valina asks, and thank you again, Valina, so much for being here. I'm so excited about next week. China backs Iran and Syria. U.S. Backs Israel, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and United Arab Emirates. Where do Turkey, Qatar stand, and Iraq?
Well, Turkey and Qatar are mostly on Iran's side. They both try to play different sides of the game. Iraq, sadly, is really just completely controlled, in my opinion, by Iran. It's really not. Iraq's number one purpose right now is a land bridge for Iranian weapons to go to other parts of the Middle East. It's a sad truth.
Really?
Hopefully that will change.
I had no idea. Wow.
We delivered Iraq to the Iranians.
Wow. Thank you so much for that. Wow. And if you guys want to follow up with that, Dave, if you've written anything about that, or Jake, definitely, I'm very interested in that, so I'll include that within this. The emissary, thank you so much for being here, says, do you see any cross-cultural exchanges between Israel and these Arab countries?
Absolutely. So the biggest thing is what I mentioned earlier, the Hadassah Hospital going over to set up a branch in Dubai is huge news. That's one example. We're seeing a lot of other cross-cultural stuff. And remember, folks, these were not aspects of the Israeli-Egyptian peace of 1978-79. Thankfully, that did stop the outward wars. There's no denying that. But there was never a financial or a cultural exchange. That movie, The Band's Visit, and the Broadway winning, the Tony winning play, The Band's Visit, a work of fiction, didn't happen. There isn't enough cultural exchange, even after 40 years of that peace deal. So I'm already seeing more cultural exchanges. It's really happening. And that, of course, helps answer our earlier question about the Arab street being more in favor of it. This is really happening.
Dave?
You're right. No, I agree. There are stupid people like Chris Hayes, and sort of that ilk, and I just use him as a shorthand to cover a wide variety of kind of mainstream media dumbasses. But he goes and he says, oh well, this is a fake piece because I want to get away. But I want to get away from that because everybody already kind of assumes that the media is not kind of sharing the wealth. So, the personalities don't really make a difference to me. They're they're not culprits. But I want to skip on. A little bit. But the point is that all of these criticisms that he's making is far more applicable to the Israel-Egypt piece, which is exactly what Jake was saying, which was in every way inauthentic if you want to compare it to the authentic piece that's happening now.
And thank you so much for that. And Homo Desperado, and I hope that's not a bad thing that you just made me say, but thank you so much for being here. Says hi from Turkey, and I think it's just a comment, but they say hi from Turkey, but I think it's not about the economy, and then they say blah, blah, blah. So I'm very interested if they want to elaborate, or if does that mean anything to you guys?
Yeah, I mean, look, obviously it's not just about the economic ties. A huge part of this is creating a block against Iran. The Iran nuclear deal, which the Saudis and the Israelis correctly defined as something that would definitely give the Iranians a nuclear weapon and would definitely give them many more billions of dollars to create more mayhem in the Middle East, which is exactly what they did with the money. So sure, that is still to me the number one catalyst. But the fact that it's also has such an important economic caveat, which can't be denied. I'm sorry, I agree with you. It's not only about economy, but it's got a lot to do with it. And the fact that it does have a lot to do with economic tie-ups is really important. And if you dismiss that, you're really missing a big part of the story.
Dave?
Agreed.
And Nancy and I have traveled to Turkey, and we love Turkey. And I love haggling with the people in the bazaar, and I learned a little bit of Turkish. And I still remember it to this day because I enjoy negotiations so much. And now we're that single round in Family Feud where like the other person's in the booth and you guys are just shouting off answers. And hopefully you guys will win because we've got an hour and 25. I'm not going to let you guys break the record. So Valina asks, do you see potential for a free trade deal between EU, between Europe and the Gulf countries? And how about green technologies? And I know that's something you're very excited about, Jake. So we got to answer it and go on.
Yeah. I would say no, but I do see a chance that the United Kingdom, Britain, will have a free trade deal before the EU.
Oh, wow. 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 And that's interesting. Dave, are you following that at all?
I am not. So I trust Jake.
I know Jake has been engaged there. So I'm going to skip around. So Jeff, the markets work. Thank you so much for being here. Says with the U.S. support, GCC seemingly formed accord against extremism over the last couple of years. Different approach. Dave, can you help me out with
I'm not sure exactly what the question is. I think it's a true enough statement. For sure, the GCC has done a lot. I mean, it's sort of
what is GCC? What is GCC?
Gulf Cooperation Council.
Oh, what countries are a member of that? Is that the way it works?
Well, I mean, all of those countries. Qatar is also GCC. So when you when you talk about sort of GCC as GCC, it's hard to make a definitive statement because they have a very different take on political Islam than the Saudis and the Emiratis do right now. So, but let's say in general, yes, let's say the anti-Qatar coalition, best described in 2017 against Qatar, Saudis and Emiratis leading it. They do have a very different take on the terrorism issue, and they've been forthright against Islamists, not only in their region but also in Europe as well.
Thank you so much for that. And Ruben, thank you so much for being here. Do you see a path to a scenario where Syria turns towards Israel or at least becomes neutral?
Well, it's a tough path, but the path will run through Lebanon. As we speak right now, the Lebanese are negotiating with the Israelis on maritime deals as far as water rights and things like that. That's huge, another huge story that hasn't been covered. So I think Syria is a much tougher deal because the country is so internally destroyed, not to mention the fact that they have other issues. But if the Lebanese people are able to continue what has been a pushback against Hezbollah and Iranian influence, and this continues to get traction, then that leads us to a path towards Syria. So the answer is not a direct path, but there's an indirect path through Lebanon. Watch Lebanon first, and then we'll have an answer about Syria.
Dave?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, at first blush, I would say the answer is no. But Jake is right to point towards some possible hopeful signs in Syria in Lebanon. But I think Syria is going to be a hard no, pretty much for as long as the regime. Actually, you know what? As long as any regime exists, any Islamic regime exists in Syria, it's going to be a hard no.
And so, Homo Desperado, and again, I hope you're not making me say a bad word, but says, and she says, so you have to see that spelled out. But Saudi Arabia has never accepted Palestinian refugees. Turkey is the first country. Can you help me understand that a little bit better without getting can you be responsive to that? So again, they say Saudi Arabia has never accepted Palestinian refugees. Turkey is the first country. And then they say accepted Israel. So I'm sure they're having a little bit of a lapse in the translating that part.
Right. Well, the first statement is certainly true, and it goes for far more than Saudi Arabia. Most of these countries have never accepted Palestinian refugees as citizens. Some will take them in and build refugee camps, like we saw in Lebanon. And the point of that is to sort of maintain the running open store of the occupation and the to use the issue against Israel diplomatically. We've seen this in country after country. So as far as the second statement, I'm not sure what Turkey's position is on that. I have to say, I'm ignorant of that.
And one of the interesting things about Twitter and Periscope is I get to see a bit of an engagement here. So Rep Faisal, thank you so much for being here. They're commenting to each other, so I think that's pretty cool, right? Because we're all having dinner or lunch, right? He says, I'm Saudi and this is false. So she had said, but also we accepted Palestinian, also Jewish refugees. And then Rep Faisal, and everyone's been so respectful because I know that there's so much emotional issues within this that we're all just trying to touch on, but not try and resolve within this. Says, I'm Saudi and this is false. So I want to thank everybody for being just so respectful to each other. And AE Swins, thank you. I recognize that picture, so thank you so much for being here. It says, please say the name of this movie documentary again. It was
Blood Money.
Yeah, Blood Money. It's about 30 minutes long, which is the perfect length for that type of a thing. I really enjoyed it because it allowed me to kind of see it, take it in, and then kind of think about it later. And I still think about how journalists are not disclosing their ties. They're leaving things deliberately ambiguous. So I think the movie does a really good job of showing how they're preying on the ambiguity of these financial contracts and arrangements. It's really interesting.
Adam, that last little exchange that you were showing, that little argument we were showing, is one of the reasons why I am so optimistic about this. If you talk to any Muslims or Arab Muslims in the United States or in the Middle East, inevitably they will start to boast about how good their country or their particular culture has been to the Jews over the generations. It's something they like to boast about. They like to say, hey, a lot better to live in Egypt in 1750 than it was in, France or something. And, they got a point. So that's one of the reasons why I am optimistic, because clearly there's some point of cultural pride involved here. They would like to be known as peacemakers and not the kind of people who brought European-style hatred of the Jews to. It's hard to explain, but you can see it in that little exchange. Didn't you see how they were both trying to sort of outdo each other for more decency to others? That's a good sign.
I thought, yeah, I did see that. You're right, I did see that. So my apologies for saying no. I interrupted when I said no. I did see that. And I also, just as I expected, everyone, we're not our ruling regime. So we also have that kind of problem that sometimes we have to defend kind of a regime that we don't even like. And, we're just not that. People are people. And I understand these things are tricky. And I've lived overseas a lot, where I've lived in some countries that are burning with a lot of legacy code that can be very bad. So I'm going to skip through because there's a few more. David, again, thank you for being here. Says, big distinction is UAE, Bahrain, Israel relations were happening on business level prior to the Accords. It's an interesting observation.
That's true.
That's true, but don't underestimate Arab culture for public, formal handshaking and agreements. If you we're hearing this a lot from the American types that Dave was talking about, the naysayers. They don't know anything about Arab culture. A public peace treaty deal, public handshakes, hugs, these kinds of things, they really, really mean something in the Arab culture, which is why you have to be careful when you do it to Arab terrorists, when you show them respect. It's a very dangerous thing to do, but it goes both ways. It's
okay,
I'm
gonna skip over to Dave because this is Dave's study as well. So Dave, you were gonna say?
No, I mean he's absolutely right. I mean these things are of vital importance. And yeah, I wouldn't really add anything to what Jake said. I think it was just spot on.
And Tracy is here, so thank you so much for being here, Tracy. And Tracy and I did a Periscope, and she's an expert on fossil fuels, and I'm so excited to be speaking with her again very soon. So how do you see recent peace alliances between Israel and its Arab neighbors affecting the Arab peace?
Well, I'm going to talk about something that happened.
And she
in
added
March.
to that. She added to that. So it's a two-part.
So that makes more sense. Okay.
Yeah. How do you see recent peace alliances between Israel and its Arab neighbors affecting the Arab peace initiative of 2002?
Well, it flipped a lot of it on its head. There was an incident that happened, and I wrote about this for CNBC. I believe this happened in March of 2018. And it's not 100% confirmed, but it's important to understand that the Arab world and Iran believes this happened. 3 Israeli F-35 jets flew round trip from Tel Aviv over Tehran and back to Israel undetected. Now, again, not 100% confirmed, but a decent amount of Iranians believe this happened, and a decent amount of the Arab world believe this happened. And that was a huge catalyst for a lot of these deals that have happened ever since, because it really solidified in the minds of the Middle Eastern world that the Israelis had the U.S. backing at a level never seen before, and that they had a weapon that could really change everything in the Middle East without it being a nuclear weapon. So to me, again, all the other things we talked about, the nuclear deal, which has happened since 2002, the other nice arrangements that have happened, economically, don't forget that that was a seminal moment in Middle Eastern history, which is still officially a secret mission. But it was reported in the Saudi and the Kuwaiti papers, and that's all it needed to happen.
Okay, so we're going to skip around. So Eric, thank you so much for being here. And I'm going to assign the speaker this time because we got a lot of questions and we're going to rip through them. And I'm not going to let you guys break the Periscope record here for time. My Periscope record for time. So Eric, thank you again for being here. How does this affect reason for maintaining NATO? And then they wrote in parentheses, Libya and Africa. So Dave, can you help me understand that?
I don't know. I mean, look, I think NATO is an answer. NATO in 2020 is an answer to a question that has kind of long expired. What we need to do to figure out how to make NATO relevant again, I think will certainly take into account some of the things that have been happening in the Middle East. I mean, you have Turkey as a NATO member. I think at this point you've got to be crazy to say that that's a good bet. NATO does not have a mechanism internally for expelling a member nation, so you're going to see an end of NATO before you see Turkey being ejected from it. I don't see that. I'm not sure that particular alliance will stand the test of time more than 5-10 years.
Gotcha. And thank you for answering that. And David says, and Jake, we were discussing this as well in our last Periscope, but Israel is a leader at wastewater reclamation and basically solved and desalinization and basically solved water issues.
Oh, yeah. Well, can someone call Governor Gavin Newsom of California and let him know about this? Because I think California should be really making a major deal with Israel right now and figuring out their issue there. No, this is a bigger issue also that we haven't talked about as much. It's sure you can say this is an economic issue, but it's an absolute life or death issue. And and Adam, you're going to start seeing this being more of a bridge between Israel and India, which is already very strong under Modi, but it's going to get stronger as these projects go along. Desalination is something Israel's always done really, really well. It's always been a national obsession, and you can't go wrong with that. And how can you not be interested in that if you're a city like Dubai? I mean, you can't survive.
And thank you very much for that. And David, again, and as I said before, he was so helpful to me in understanding the intrigues of the political elections because I didn't know anything about it. So I would DM him, say, help me understand this. And Dave, this is for you. Unfortunately, nothing is irrevocable. And I can't read it with this light, but it looks like Israel had amazing synergies with Iran pre-1979 as well.
Yeah, look, I mean, he makes a good point. I think there are structural differences between, to go back just to fill everyone in. Israel did have a great relationship with the Shah, the previous regime in Iran, or the regime in Iran prior to the Islamic Revolution in '79. In fact, the Israelis built the airport over there. And there was a lot of trade and a lot of kind of good stuff between the two countries. I don't think you're going to see a mass Islamist movement to topple internally, to topple either Saudi Arabia or the Emirates. That's just not what the population looks like. That's not in really in anyone's forecast. So I think it'll be different. Can anything happen? Sure. 100 years from now, 50 years from now, a completely different population could displace a completely different regime. But I think as time goes on, very shortly it will be such that, and kind of speaks to the question about the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002. Very shortly, I think a lot of things that many of us clung to as very important are just going to be overtaken by events, and I think that we're going to be reaping. All of these countries are going to be reaping the benefit of this peace and this realignment.
Gotcha. So thank you very much. And now we're at such a speedy round because there's so many more good questions. So it's been 1 hour and 40, and we're going to try and wrap this up in about 6 minutes. So it's like Superman racing the Flash, right? It's that fast. So
go.
Here says, how does this normalization affect Israel in regards to Hamas?
Oh, really bad news for Hamas. They lose a lot of their funding stream.
Okay. Thank you. You can add to that. That was too quick. Do you have anything more to add to that? Because I know that's a complicated question.
You know what? It's just, I think the Saudis had actually closed the funding to Hamas for a long time. This solidifies it, and it proves to the world, and proves, more importantly to the Saudis, that they made the right choice there. So Hamas now has really only one funder. It's Iran through the Qatari conduit. That means just one more window to close, folks. And I'm encouraged by that.
Right. I mean, we can go back to the last war that Israel had with Hamas. The Saudis and the Emiratis were pressing Israel to finish up, clean their clock in Gaza, which was sort of the first inkling that some of us got that this realignment was coming, because that's something that 20 years ago would just not have happened.
And thank you so much for that. And Vijay Kumar, thank you so much for being here. Says, will there be a threat to MBS if he goes with Israel, as he had made many enemies within?
Sure, I think it's reasonable. The specter of Anwar Sadat is hanging over every Arab leader, and has since when he was killed in the early 80s. I think he's got to maintain control, and I think he's doing that pretty well. But as the populations change, the threat of that kind of retaliatory action over making peace is going to lessen. Of course, there'll be holdouts, but frankly, the holdouts, let's say in Saudi Arabia, are the ones who are in jail already for terrorism.
Oh, interesting, Jake. I know it's a good question, yeah. And you guys have been so great with good answers. So
here's what I have to say about the safety of Mohammed bin Salman. I like his odds. Okay, I mean, remember a couple of years ago, he put about 200 of the most powerful people in Saudi Arabia into a house arrest at the Riyadh. I think it was the Ritz-Carlton. And including Alawid bin Talal, who, bless his heart, who was reading the tea leaves. He wasn't stupid. He spent about a year starting to say nice things about Israel, which he didn't used to do, hoping to make it clear to Mohammed bin Salman that he was on his team. But I think he was too powerful and too rich to be left alone. He came out of that about 20 pounds lighter and a lot quieter. My point is, unlike Anwar Sadat, Saudi Arabia is a much smaller populated country, and there's been a lot of pre-work done to this situation. And like I said, Mohammed bin Salman, I like his odds to survive any issue with that. I really do.
And thank you so much for that. And S. Mukherjee, thank you so much for being here, says, what is Libya's stake in all this post the Arab Spring?
It depends. It depends which Libya you're talking about. Libya has now, over the last 2-3 years or so, been in what could be called a civil war. You have the anti-Islamist rebel forces led by General Haftar, U.S. educated. Actually, I think he's a U.S. citizen. who's been there, who's been trying to fight the UN, EU, Muslim Brotherhood, and Turkey-supported government over there. So I think it's very much an open question of where things stand. It's really different every day as far as where the advantage is. But for the bigger picture is for ordinary Libyans who were suffering under Gaddafi, and then they suffered under the collapse of Gaddafi with probably the most strategically insane operation, the Libya War. Undertaken in modern times. Look, I feel really bad for the average Libyan because you've constantly traded one horrible regime for chaos for another horrible regime, sort of on and on and on. So I feel terrible for them. I wish that they would have some luck and peace in that country, but I don't think it's on offer.
Jake?
I look at Libya as something like this American South in the 1930s, when then Congress, the 1940s, when then congressional candidate LBJ went down and pointed to electric power and things like that and said, you want this kind of stuff, you need to get in, you need to join in with, with then the New Deal and that kind of thing. I would go to Libya if I were an American diplomat or if I were an Israeli and just say, like, you want in on this? You want in on this because we can bring you in. Okay, and that's why the economic aspects of this are so important. And I think the Libyan people have to be sold. They have to be campaigned to. And because of Gaddafi and the people who came after him, have we ever had a chance to even speak directly to those people? I don't think so. Maybe we'll get it now, and then we'll have another discussion.
So we're up to two last questions. These are speed round, and they're complicated. So it's a complicated speed answer. So Pastor Derek T, thank you so much for being here. Says very concerned that China will want to protect any investments in that region.
All right, then get involved with the UAE in working with the Haifa port. Make sure that let the UAE be the ones who are the personal managers there. Take out any surveillance or industrial espionage junk that you want there, and you'll save yourself a lot of money and time. I don't know if the Chinese communist regime thinks in that logical way, but that's what I would tell them. Honestly, they clearly are willing to take losses in return for some kind of influence long term. I don't know if they can be spoken to that way, but if they want to save money, then stop the nonsense.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I could probably be more responsive to that in that I'm very familiar with the very opaque loans and what's going on with the Exim Bank and the vulnerabilities of the countries in the region with their GDP. And we're seeing that today with America is doing a deal with the Maldives, which the Maldives has suffered tremendous economic shock. And it has 30% of its GDP pledged to China. So things are interesting in the region. I do think these are all proxy wars that are being fought out, and I do think, just as an example with the Maldives today, that we're winning, and hopefully we'll solve the problems in Djibouti next. So, Pastor Derek T, those are the same concerns as I have, and I do feel that today's news with the Maldives kind of shows you the trend going forward that there's a war going on. I think we're winning it. So at least right now we're winning. It was a good strategic move today. So we're going to close with a really interesting question for both of you who have so much deep familiarity with the culture, and it's going to be our closing. So you're not a fan. Thank you so much for being here. What a nice picture that is with your child. Says that it's nice that Arab countries are making peace, but how about changing their educational system? And Dave, would you mind answering that?
Sure. I saw that question. It was a fantastic question. I need to find. I'm sorry that I forgot her name, but she is an academic who's actually written quite extensively on the new Saudi educational program. And she's got several pieces. I think in UK publications. I think it's coming. Some of it has already happened, but more is on the way. If you look at outlets like Arab News, which is a really wonderful Saudi outlet that I write for on occasion, kind of semi-regularly, then you'll see some of this stuff being covered. But if you follow my Twitter, I'm going to try to find some links to to this particular woman's pieces on the Saudi educational system. It's a good point. It's something that many of us have been, kind of bugging the Saudis about for, almost 20 years now or longer, and they're finally making changes, and it's all to the good.
Jake, it's your question, and we're going to close up with it. So feel free to expand on it, but then we're going to close out. So you're the closing moments.
Real quick, just I would say what a great opportunity for Israelis, Saudis, and other Arab countries to create a new curriculum about the Middle East. And one of the things that you've heard me say many times before, let's not forget there was a history in this region between Jews and Arabs before 1933 that needs to be explored. Yes, most of the changes in education need to happen from the Palestinian side and the Saudi side, but the Israelis would do good to start educating their kids in their schools a little bit more about the history of, for example, Egyptian Jewry before the 20th century. That could be one of those olive branches that the Israelis could offer and say, we're going to talk about all the great stuff that happened between us for centuries. And that's how we're going to start, with not just telling you to erase the nasty stuff that you've had.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because we discussed a little bit in the last Periscope, and I'm just as interested in the answer to that as everybody else is. So Dave, please do follow up with that author. And I think, Dave, you had also said that there's the above 40 crowd and there's the below 40 crowd, and the above 40 crowd, of which I'm kind of a member of, even though I don't want to be a member of. I'm happy with being a member. They took my membership.
I'm chronologically in that group too,
Yeah. It's kind of one of those things that you have to, they opt you into, right? They automatically enroll you into it, and then they won't let you opt out of it. So, but I'm very interested in the under 40 crowd, and then particularly in like the under 10 crowd, because they're the ones that are 10 years from now. So, I mean, we're going to see attrition from what's happening now down to those 10 and 11-year-olds who are now just getting imprinted. So what are you guys seeing there? I mean, have you seen real movement?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I don't want to speak to the under 10 crowd. I don't know any under 10.
In terms of education,
folks in the Gulf. Right. In terms of education. I mean, look, I'll give you a little indication of what's gone on. The Muslim World League was an organization. It was sort of it was set up as, I don't know if we have an analog in the West, but it was sort of set up as a youth organization, a youth pedagogical organization for Muslims throughout the world, and teaching them how to practice Islam, how to be Muslims. It was run by the Muslim Brotherhood. It was formed and run by the Muslim Brotherhood. They were distributing Hassan al-Banna and Qaradawi and Sayyid Qutb materials to Muslims all over the world. I know because I literally collect these books in English. They make these little, they used to make these cute little books of Muslim Brotherhood literature. Well, not so long ago, a few years ago, the Saudis completely revamped the Muslim World League. Actually, interesting aside, the guy who used to run the Muslim World League was Huma Abedin's dad, which her late father, which at the time it was straight up brotherhood. But the Saudis went and they cleaned it out, and they made it into an instrument of interfaith outreach. And they put Dr. Alisa in charge of it, and he's gone to Auschwitz, and he's written some amazing things for Western audiences, and also for Muslim audiences in the East. So I think there has been a very big effort with a lot of money put behind it in order to sort of engage on the interfaith level. But I did have I wrote a piece in the Federalist about how interfaith dialogue is nonsense and counterproductive unless you deal with states as states, because it doesn't get you anywhere, to have nice, cozy feelings about, Jews or Muslims or Christians or whatever. That's nice. But at the end of the day, that doesn't move the ball forward in a real way when it comes to real people's lives and problems and things like that. So the steps that these countries are taking diplomatically with Israel are a lot more significant than any kind of than billions poured into interfaith outreach. And to their credit, both the Saudis and the Emiratis, I mean, heck, nobody's been as eager to spend money on interfaith outreach as the Emiratis. They're building a massive center. They're building what could be the biggest synagogue per square foot in the world.
Really?
In Abu Dhabi, yeah.
Wow.
Does that? I mean, that's nice and great, and
That's pretty awesome.
and touching and beautiful. Yeah, of course. But at the end of the day, dealing state to state is a lot more meaningful, because then you actually have results. You have countries and nations that have interests, strategic, economic, military, diplomatic interests that problems that can actually be solved, as opposed to kumbaya moments.
Jake, it's all up to you now. We're going to close out on that. So, I know this is a subject of great interest here.
Well, notice how at the peace deal signing between UAE, Bahrain, and Israel, both of the Arab leaders, the UAE leader and the Bahraini leader, mentioned the younger generation. Because they understand two things. They understand that economically there's not enough oil jobs, and the economics are not good for that generation. There's not enough jobs for them. But they also understood something else, which is they need to tell those young people that these Jews that you're going to be working with in Israel are not subhuman. They can be people that you can deal with. Don't listen to the Islamist genocidal stuff. So they understand that this goes hand in hand. You're not going to have economic expansion in this country and in this world unless they start dealing with Israel. And that's the great way to finish it.
You guys broke the record. That's not even fair, because it's not fair. Last week we did something with Rajiv and Harsh, and that went an hour 48, and that was awesome. And you guys went an hour and 56. So you guys I guarantee you guys are going to hold forever this record of the length of my Periscopes, and it's been so informative. So I really want to thank both of you guys. There are still so many questions, and my apologies that it's going to be difficult for us to go through any of them any further. And I want to thank everybody so much for their time and for their very thoughtful and very respectful comments. And I saw many, even where there were some disagreements, and people were just so respectful to each other. And I appreciate that so much. And to both of you for really helping all of us kind of better understand the nuances and the diplomacy and kind of what's going on. And did we touch on the military contracts that we're seeing now, Jake? I know.
Well, we talked about the UAE and how the Israelis are no longer going to object to them getting the F-35. But yeah, there's been some deals between Elbit Systems, which is a great stock to follow, ESLT on the Nasdaq. There's already been some stories there. So if you look that up on Google, you'll see some of the deals that have been made.
And you said before they used to fit their airplanes in a very specific way, the F-15s.
Oh, well, the F-35, the Israelis tricked out a couple of years ago. So the F-35 that the Israelis use is going to be a lot different than the one that the UAE gets to use, which is one of the reasons why there's less of an objection there.
Oh, that's really interesting. So thank you for including that. And I'm glad I remembered it was from our earlier conversation. So I'm going to click end broadcast in just a moment. If you guys would be kind enough to stay here with me, that'd be great. But for everybody else, we're all going to be saying goodbye. And I want to thank everybody for allowing Jake and Dave and myself to be on your Twitter feed today. And hopefully we were good guests. So thank you very much. Thank you, Jake. And thank you, Dave.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye. And I'm going to press it now. Bye-bye.